I was standing in my kitchen at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning coffee mug, halfway to my lips, when my phone buzzed with a text that made my blood run cold. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can you come over? It's about Dad." The mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the tile floor in a spray of ceramic and dark roast. My daughter Sarah never texted about her father, my ex-husband, unless something was seriously wrong. We'd been divorced for 12 years, and in all that time she'd maintained a careful neutrality about the man who'd walked out on our 23-year marriage for his dental hygienist. On my way, I typed back my hands trembling slightly as I grabbed my keys from the counter. The drive to Sarah's house took 20 minutes through the tree-lined streets of suburban Columbus, past the coffee shops and yoga studios that had sprouted up since I'd moved to my smaller place downtown. The October air was crisp leaves scattered across the windshield in brilliant reds and golds, but I barely noticed the beauty. My mind was spinning through possibilities, none of them good. Sarah's front door opened before I could knock. "Mom!" She wrapped me in a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I could feel the tension in her shoulders. At 31, my daughter had inherited my stubborn streak and her father's analytical mind, but right now she looked younger or vulnerable in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "What's going on, sweetheart?" She led me into her kitchen where 2 cups of coffee were already waiting. The morning light streamed through her bay windows, illuminating the photos on her refrigerator, her wedding last spring family gatherings, pictures of me and her together at various stages of our lives. Notably absent were any recent photos of her father. "Dad called me last night." She began wrapping her hands around her mug like it could anchor her. "He wants to reconcile." I felt my stomach drop. "Reconcile? What do you mean?" "With you, Mom. He says he's made a terrible mistake. He wants to try again." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of her refrigerator and the distant sound of morning traffic. I sank into one of her kitchen chairs, trying to process what she'd just said. "Sarah, honey, your father and I have been divorced for over a decade. We're different people now. I'm different." She nodded, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "I know, Mom, but he sounded so sincere. He said he's been thinking about it for months, that he realizes what he lost." "What about Janet?" I asked, referring to the dental hygienist who'd become his second wife. "They're getting divorced too." Sarah's voice was quiet. "He said it was never real love, not like what you two had." I stood up abruptly, needing to move to think. Through the kitchen window, I could see Sarah's neighbour, Mrs. Chen, tending to her late-season chrysanthemums, methodically deadheading the spent blooms. There was something comforting about the ordinary ritual, the steady progression of seasons and tasks. "Honey, I appreciate that you're caught in the middle of this, but I need you to understand something." I turned back to face my daughter. "I've built a good life. I have my book club, my volunteering at the literacy centre, my little condo that's finally decorated exactly how I want it. I'm not the same woman your father left 12 years ago." Sarah's face crumpled slightly. "But don't you miss what we used to have when we were all together?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course I missed it, the easy rhythm of family dinners, the way David used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the shared history of raising a child together. But I also remembered the loneliness of those last few years, the growing distance, the way he'd stopped really seeing me. "I miss the good parts," I said carefully, "but I can't forget why it ended." My phone buzzed then, and both Sarah and I glanced at it. David's name appeared on the screen. "He wants to meet for lunch," I read aloud. "To talk." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes hopeful. "Maybe you should, Mom, just to hear what he has to say." I stared at the phone, feeling the weight of the moment. Part of me was curious, what could David possibly say after all these years? But a larger part of me was protective of the peace I'd fought so hard to build. "I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't know." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I drove home to my condo, a converted warehouse unit with exposed brick walls and large windows that filled the space with light. It was nothing like the suburban house David and I had shared, with its formal dining room and perfectly manicured lawn. This place was mine, every book on the shelves, every piece of art on the walls, every plant in the windowsill chosen, because it spoke to me. I tried to distract myself with household tasks, but my mind kept circling back to David's message. Finally, at 11:30, I called my best friend Margaret. He wants to what? Margaret's voice crackled through the phone with indignation. We'd known each other since our daughters were in elementary school together, and she'd been my anchor through the divorce. Meet for lunch to talk about reconciling. Oh, honey, are you seriously considering this, mate? I sank into my favorite reading chair, the one I'd bought 6 months after the divorce was final. I don't know what I'm considering, it's just, what if he really has changed? Linda. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Do you remember what you were like right after he left? Do you remember how long it took you to stop jumping every time the phone rang, hoping it was him calling to say he'd made a mistake? I closed my eyes, the memories flooding back. The sleepless nights, the weight loss, the way I'd analysed every interaction we'd had in those final months, looking for signs I'd missed. I remember. And do you remember how hard you worked to build the life you have now? The volunteer work, the book club, that photography class you took last spring. Yes. Then why would you risk that for a man who threw you away once already? Her words stung, but they also rang true. After David left, I'd spent months in therapy learning to rediscover who I was outside of being someone's wife. It had been terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Maybe I should at least hear what he has to say, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. Of course you should do whatever feels right to you, Margaret said, but promise me you'll think about it carefully. Don't let nostalgia cloud your judgment. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight. My phone sat silent on the coffee table, David's message still unanswered. At 2 o'clock, my book club met at the local coffee shop. We were reading Educated by Tara Westover, and the discussion was particularly lively. Joan, our unofficial leader, was passionate about the themes of family loyalty versus self-preservation. Sometimes, she said, her silver hair catching the light, the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries even with family. Her words resonated more than she knew. Around the table sat 5 other women, all of us in our 40s, 50s and 60s, all with stories of challenges overcome and wisdom hard won. There was Ruth, who'd gone back to school at 55 to become a nurse, Patricia, who'd started her own catering business after her husband's death, Anne, who'd finally left an emotionally abusive marriage at 62. Speaking of family drama, Ruth said with a wry smile, my ex-husband contacted me last week asking if we could try again. Apparently his 3rd marriage isn't working out. The group erupted in a mixture of laughter and supportive outrage. What did you tell him? Patricia asked. I told him I'd rather date a cactus, Ruth replied, which sent us all into peals of laughter. But as the laughter died down, I found myself speaking. What if he really had changed, though? What if he genuinely realized what he'd lost? The table went quiet, and I could feel everyone's attention focused on me. Linda, Joan said gently, is there something you want to talk about? So I told them. About Sarah's text that morning, about David's message about the confusion and uncertainty that had been gnawing at me all day. As I spoke, I could see understanding and concern in their faces. The question isn't whether he's changed, Anne said when I finished. The question is whether you want to change back into the person you'd have to be to make it work with him. Her words hit me like a revelation. I thought about the woman I'd been during my marriage, always accommodating, always putting David's needs first, gradually shrinking myself to fit into the space he'd allowed me. Then I thought about the woman I was now confident, independent, surrounded by friends who valued my opinions and respected my choices. I don't want to change back, I said quietly. Then you have your answer, Joan said. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and my phone. David's message stared back at me, still unanswered. I thought about Sarah, about the hope I'd seen in her eyes that morning. I thought about the family we'd once been and the different but equally valuable life I'd built since. Finally, I began to type, David, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not interested in reconciling. I wish you well, but I've moved on with my life, and I'm happy where I am now. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. My phone rang almost immediately. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Mom, Dad said you turned him down. I did, sweetheart. There was a long pause. Are you sure he seemed really sincere when he talked to me? I walked to my living room window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Sarah, I know this might be hard to understand, but I'm not the same person I was when your father and I were married. I've grown and changed, and I like who I've become. I don't want to go backwards. But what about second chances? What about forgiveness? Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to let someone back into your life in the same way they were before, I said. I forgave your father years ago for my own peace of mind, but forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I guess I just thought, maybe we could be a family again. My heart ached for her. Honey, we are a family, just not the same configuration we used to be. You and I, we're family. Your father and you, your family. That doesn't change just because your father and I aren't together. I know, she said, and I could hear the tears in her voice. I just miss how simple everything used to be. I know you do, but sometimes complicated can be better than simple if it's more honest. After we hung up, I made myself another cup of tea and settled into my reading chair with a book. But instead of reading, I found myself reflecting on the path that had brought me here. The divorce had been devastating at first, but it had also been the beginning of a journey towards self-discovery that I wouldn't trade for anything. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. How did the conversation go with Romeo? I told him no. I typed back, good for you. Want to celebrate with dinner tomorrow night? I know a great new Italian place. Absolutely. I smiled, setting the phone aside. Tomorrow night I'd have dinner with my best friend, sharing stories and laughter over good food and wine. This weekend I'd volunteer at the Literacy Centre, helping adults learn to read. Next week, book club would meet again, and we'd dive into our next literary adventure together. It was a good life, not perfect, but mine. I'd built it from the ground up, brick by brick, choice by choice, and I wasn't willing to tear it down for the ghost of what used to be. The next morning brought another text from David, longer this time. Linda, I understand you need time to think about this. I know I hurt you badly, and I don't expect forgiveness to come easily, but I've been in therapy for 6 months working on understanding why I made such terrible choices. I'm not the same man who left you for Janet. Could we at least meet for coffee just to talk? I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me was curious about this supposedly changed version of my ex-husband. Part of me wondered if I owed it to our shared history to at least listen to what he had to say. But a larger part of me recognized the subtle manipulation in his words, the assumption that I needed time to think, rather than that I might have already made a considered decision. I showed the message to Margaret over lunch. Classic David, she said, shaking her head. Still trying to control the narrative, still assuming he knows what's best for everyone. What do you mean? Look at the language, honey. I understand you need time to think. Not, I understand you've made your decision. He's already decided that your no wasn't real, just a temporary response that needs to be overcome. I read the message again, seeing it through Margaret's eyes. She was right. Even in his supposed contrition, David was still trying to manage me, still operating from the assumption that he knew better than I did what I needed. I'm going to block his number, I said. Are you sure? What about Sarah? If he has something important to say about Sarah, he can go through her. But I don't need him having direct access to me anymore. That afternoon, I did exactly that. I blocked David's number, and for the first time all week, I felt truly at peace with my decision. But peace, I discovered, was a fragile thing. 3 days later, Sarah called in tears. Mom, Dad's been calling me constantly. He's convinced that you're making a mistake, that you're just scared to try again. He wants me to convince you to give him a chance. I sank onto my couch, feeling a familiar weight settle in my chest. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your father is putting you in an impossible position, and that's not fair to you. But what if he's right? What if you are just scared? Even if I were scared, which I'm not, that would be my right. Sarah, I spent 23 years married to your father. I know exactly who he is, and more importantly, I know who I am now. I don't want to go back to being the woman I was then. But people can change, Mom. Some people can. But the fundamental dynamic between your father and me hasn't changed. He's still trying to control the situation, still trying to manage my responses through you. That's exactly the kind of behavior that made our marriage impossible. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I never thought of it that way. Honey, I need you to tell your father that his constant calls are putting stress on your relationship with me. Tell him that if he truly respects my decision, he'll stop using you as a go-between. And if he doesn't stop, I took a deep breath. Then you'll have to decide what boundaries you need to set with him, but that's your choice to make, not mine. After we hung up, I felt emotionally drained. This was exactly the kind of drama I'd been hoping to avoid by saying no in the first place. David's inability to accept my decision was proving my point more effectively than any argument I could have made. That evening, I attended my photography class at the community centre. We were working on portrait photography, learning to capture emotion and character in a single frame. As I looked through the lens at my partner, an energetic woman named Carol, who'd taken up photography after retiring from teaching, I thought about perspective, how the same subject could look completely different depending on the angle and lighting you chose. You're getting good at this, Carol said as we reviewed the shots we'd taken. You have an eye for finding the real person behind the pose. Her compliment warmed me. Photography was something I'd never had time for during my marriage, always too busy managing household schedules and family obligations. Now it was becoming a real passion, a way of seeing the world that was entirely my own. I love how freeing it is, I told her. Nobody else's expectations to manage, just me and the subject and the moment. Carol nodded knowingly. That's the beauty of starting something new later in life. You're doing it purely for yourself, not because you think you should, or because someone else wants you to. On the drive home, I thought about what she'd said. So much of my adult life had been shaped by other people's expectations. First my parents, then David's, then Sarah's. Learning to make choices based purely on my own desires and values had been one of the most difficult and rewarding parts of my post-divorce journey. The next week brought a new development. Sarah called to tell me that she'd finally set boundaries with her father. I told him he needed to stop calling me about you, she said. I told him that his constant pressure was making me uncomfortable and that he needed to respect both your decision and my relationship with you. How did he take it? Not well at first. He got angry and accused me of taking sides, but I held firm. I told him that I love both of you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be his messenger service. I felt a surge of pride in my daughter. That must have been difficult. It was, but you were right, it wasn't fair of him to put me in that position. And honestly, it made me think about some other ways he's tried to control situations over the years. We talked for another half hour, and I could hear a new maturity in Sarah's voice, a growing understanding of family dynamics that went beyond the simple child's wish for her parents to be together. A few days later, I ran into David at the grocery store. I was in the produce section carefully selecting apples for a pie I was making for book club when I heard his voice behind me. Linda! I turned around, my heart jumping slightly despite my mental preparation for this possibility. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner and completely grey now, his face showing the wear of whatever stress he'd been under. But his eyes were the same, that intense blue that had first attracted me 35 years ago. Hello, David. We stood there for a moment in the fluorescent lighting of the grocery store, surrounded by the mundane bustle of other shoppers going about their daily lives. It felt surreal, this ordinary encounter, after all the emotional intensity of the past few weeks. You look good, he said. Happy. I'm happy. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I got your message, through Sarah, about the boundaries. Good. I hope you'll respect them. I just want you to know that I understand why you're angry. I know I hurt you badly, and I don't expect you to just forget that. but I also think you're not giving me a chance to show you how much I've changed." I set down the apple I'd been holding and turned to face him fully. "David, this isn't about anger. I'm not angry anymore. I worked through that years ago. This is about the fact that I've built a good life and I don't want to disrupt it. But don't you think we owe it to our history to at least try?" There it was again, that assumption that he knew what I owed, what I should feel, what I should do. The old David wrapped in a package of supposed humility. "I don't owe our history anything," I said calmly. "I honoured our history by grieving it properly and then moving on. That was my gift to what we used to have." His face tightened slightly. "So that's it? You won't even consider the possibility that we could be better together now? David, you're doing it again. Doing what? Telling me what I should consider, what I should feel, what I should do. You're so focused on what you want that you're not actually hearing what I'm saying." He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to catch himself. For a moment I saw a flicker of something, maybe genuine recognition, maybe just calculation. I couldn't tell which. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "You're right, I'm not listening." "No, you're not. And that's exactly why this wouldn't work. You're still the same person who thinks he knows better than everyone else what's good for them." I picked up my basket and started to walk away, then turned back. "David, I genuinely hope you find happiness, but you're not going to find it by trying to recreate something that didn't work the first time. You need to build something new." As I walked away, I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. The encounter had confirmed everything I'd suspected about David's supposed transformation. He might have learned to use different words, but the fundamental dynamic was unchanged. That evening, I called Margaret to tell her about the grocery store encounter. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Relieved, actually. Seeing him in person, talking to him directly, it made me absolutely certain that I made the right decision." "Good for you. And how's Sarah handling all this?" "Better than I expected. I think setting boundaries with her father was actually good for her. She's starting to see some patterns she hadn't noticed before. It's amazing how much clearer things become when you step back from the drama, isn't it?" The following Saturday, my book club had our monthly potluck dinner. I brought the apple pie I'd been making when I encountered David at the grocery store. As we gathered around Patricia's dining room table, sharing food and stories, I felt surrounded by the warmth of genuine friendship. "You seem lighter lately," Joan observed as we cleared the dishes. "More yourself, if that makes sense." "It does make sense," I said. "I feel like I just passed a test I didn't know I was taking." I told them about David's recent attempts at reconciliation and my decision to firmly close that door. The response was immediate and supportive. "Good for you," Ruth said. "There's nothing wrong with leaving the past in the past, especially when the past wasn't that great to begin with," Patricia added with characteristic directness. Anne, who rarely spoke about her own difficult marriage, surprised me by sharing her perspective. "It takes real strength to choose yourself when everyone else is telling you to be selfless. I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier." As the evening wound down, I realized that this circle of strong, thoughtful women was part of what I'd been protecting when I said no to David. These friendships, built on mutual respect and shared experiences, were precious to me in a way that my marriage had never been. 2 weeks later, Sarah came over for our regular Sunday dinner. We were making lasagna together, a tradition we'd started after her father and I divorced. As we layered noodles and cheese and sauce, she seemed more relaxed than she'd been since this whole situation began. "Dad's dating someone new," she said casually as she spread ricotta across a layer of noodles. I paused in my stirring of the meat sauce. "Oh, her name is Rebecca. She's a librarian. He seems calmer with her, less intense." "How do you feel about that?" Sarah considered the question as she added another layer of noodles. "Relieved, honestly. I think him wanting to get back together with you was more about his fear of being alone than about actually wanting to rebuild your relationship." I felt a surge of admiration for my daughter's growing wisdom. "That's a very mature observation. I think I understand now why you said no so quickly. You saw through all the drama to what was really happening." As we slid the lasagna into the oven, Sarah wrapped me in a hug. I'm proud of you, Mom, for knowing what you wanted and sticking to it even when it was hard. Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know. That night, as I sat in my reading chair with a cup of tea and a new book, I reflected on the strange journey of the past month. David's unexpected attempt at reconciliation had forced me to examine my choices and my priorities in a way I hadn't expected. But instead of creating doubt, the experience had only strengthened my conviction that I'd built exactly the life I wanted. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "How was dinner with Sarah?" "Perfect," I typed back. "She's officially on board with my decision to stay single and fabulous." "As she should be, coffee tomorrow morning." "Absolutely." I smiled, setting the phone aside. Tomorrow I'd meet Margaret for coffee, and we'd probably laugh about the whole David situation. Next week, photography class would start a new unit on landscape photography. The week after that, my book club would begin reading a mystery novel that everyone was excited about. It was a life full of small pleasures and meaningful connections built around my own interests and values rather than someone else's expectations. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was younger, but it was authentically mine, in a way that felt precious and worth protecting. As I got ready for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was 57 years old, with laugh lines around her eyes and silver threads in her brown hair. She looked confident, content, at peace with her choices. She looked nothing like the anxious, accommodating woman who'd tried so hard to save a marriage that was already over. I liked this woman, I respected her, and I wasn't about to let anyone, not even someone who'd once been the center of my world, convince me to become someone else. The next morning brought a final surprise, a letter in my mailbox from David. Not a text or an email, but an actual handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery. For a moment I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. "Dear Linda," it began. "I wanted to write you a proper letter to apologize for my behavior over the past few weeks. After our conversation at the grocery store, I did some serious thinking about what you said. You were right, I wasn't really listening to you. I was so focused on what I wanted that I couldn't hear what you were telling me. I realize now that my desire to reconcile was more about my own regrets and fears than about genuine love or respect for you. You've built a good life and you deserve to enjoy it without interference from me. I promise to respect your boundaries going forward. I hope you'll always be happy. David." I read the letter twice, looking for hidden manipulation or subtle pressure. But it seemed genuine, perhaps the first truly honest communication I'd received from David in years. Whether it would translate into actual changed behavior remained to be seen, but it was a step in the right direction. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept important documents, not because I thought it would change anything between us, but because it felt like the end of a chapter, a final resolution to a story that had been left hanging for too long. That afternoon, I volunteered at the Literacy Centre working with Maria, a 52-year-old woman who was learning to read for the first time. As she slowly sounded out words from the simple text we were using, I was struck by her determination and courage. Here was someone who'd decided it was never too late to learn something new, to become more than she'd been before. "You're very patient," Maria said as we finished our session. "Thank you for helping me." "Thank you for reminding me how brave it is to start over," I replied. On the drive home, I thought about the parallels between Maria's journey and my own. Both of us had reached a point where we'd decided to stop accepting limitations, hers imposed by circumstances, and lack of opportunity, mine, imposed by a relationship that had shrunk my world rather than expanded it. The winter months passed peacefully. David kept his word about respecting my boundaries, and Sarah seemed to have found a new equilibrium in her relationships with both of her parents. My photography skills improved steadily, and I even sold a few prints at a local art fair. Book club continued to be a source of intellectual stimulation and deep friendship. My volunteer work at the Literacy Centre remained deeply fulfilling. By spring, the whole situation with David felt like ancient history. I ran into Janet, his second ex-wife, at the farmer's market one Saturday morning. We'd never spoken during their marriage, but now we exchanged pleasantries like two women who'd survived the same natural disaster. "I heard he tried to get back together with you," she said as we both examined the early strawberries. "Briefly, it didn't work out." She laughed not unkindly. "Smart woman. David's one of those men who thinks every problem can be solved by going backwards instead of forwards." "That's a very wise observation. Hard-won wisdom," she said with a rueful smile. "I hope his new girlfriend is paying attention." As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of kinship with her. Two women who'd loved the same complicated man and had both ultimately chosen to love themselves more. That evening, I attended Sarah's housewarming party for the new place she and her husband had bought. It was a charming colonial with a big backyard perfect for the family they were planning to start. As I watched my daughter move through her home confident and gracious as a hostess, I felt overwhelmed with pride. "You did good, Mom," my son-in-law Jake said, appearing beside me with a glass of wine. "Sarah's got such a strong sense of herself. She knows what she wants, and she's not afraid to go after it." "She gets that from both sides of the family," I said diplomatically. "Maybe, but she learned how to use it constructively from you." Later that night, as I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I reflected on Jake's comment. Had I really taught Sarah strength by example? The thought was both humbling and encouraging. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from my sister Ellen, who lived in Portland. "I've been thinking about what you told me about David," she said without preamble. Ellen had never been one for small talk. "Oh, I wanted you to know how proud I am of you for saying no. When Tom and I went through our rough patch 5 years ago, I kept thinking about whether I should stay or go. You know what made up my mind?" "What?" "Remembering how strong you were during your divorce, how you refused to settle for less than you deserved. It inspired me to insist that Tom get serious about marriage counseling, and our relationship is better now than it's ever been." I was quiet for a moment, touched by her words. I had no idea. Sometimes we don't realize how our choices ripple out and affect other people. Your decision to rebuild your life instead of accepting scraps taught me that I deserved better too. After we hung up, I sat in my sunny kitchen, thinking about the unexpected ways our decisions can influence others. I'd made the choice to leave my marriage and later to refuse David's reconciliation attempt based on what felt right for me. But apparently those choices had also given other people permission to expect more from their own lives. That afternoon, I went to the community garden where I'd rented a small plot the previous spring. The tomatoes I'd planted were starting to show tiny green fruit, and the basil was ready for its first harvest. Working with my hands in the soil surrounded by the quiet companionship of other gardeners, I felt deeply content. "Your plot is really thriving," said Mrs. Rodriguez, who tended the space next to mine. She was in her 70s, a retired teacher who'd moved to the area to be closer to her grandchildren. "Thank you. I'm still learning, but I love the process. Gardening is very forgiving," she said, deadheading some marigolds. "You make mistakes, you learn from them, you try again next season. Not like people are more complicated." "Very true. I was married for 47 years. She continued, her hands never stopping their gentle work among the plants. "Good marriage, mostly, but when my husband died 3 years ago, I discovered how much of myself I'd forgotten. Now I'm remembering who I was before I became half of a couple." Her words resonated deeply. "How does it feel remembering?" "Frightening and wonderful, like being young again, but with better judgment." That evening, I called Margaret to tell her about my conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez. "It's interesting how many women our age are having similar realizations," Margaret observed. "Maybe it's something about this stage of life finally feeling free to prioritize ourselves. Or maybe we're the first generation of women who's had enough models of independence to believe it's really possible." Could be both. As summer arrived, I found myself busier than ever. Photography class had evolved into a weekly photo walk group that explored different neighborhoods around the city. Book Club had decided to tackle War and Peace, a project that would take us through the rest of the year. The Literacy Centre had asked me to help train new volunteers, recognising my patience and skill with adult learners. In quiet moments, I sometimes thought about the path not taken, what life might have looked like if I'd said yes to David's reconciliation attempt. But the thought held no appeal, no sense of missed opportunity. If anything, it reinforced my gratitude for the choice I'd made. One evening in late July, as I was watering my container garden on my condo's small balcony, Sarah called with news. "I'm pregnant, Mom." "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful." I set down the watering can and sank into one of my deck chairs, overwhelmed with joy. "We wanted to wait until we were past the first trimester to tell everyone. I'm due in February." As we talked about due dates and doctor's appointments and nursery plans, I felt a deep sense of excitement about this new chapter in our family's story. A grandchild, what an unexpected gift this stage of life was turning out to be. "Have you told your father yet?" I asked. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. But Mom, I need you to know something." "What's that?" "When this baby comes, I want him or her to see what it looks like when a woman stands up for herself. I want to be the kind of mother who teaches strength by example." Tears pricked my eyes. "You already are that kind of woman, Sarah. This baby is going to be so lucky." That night I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance and thinking about the future. In a few months I'd be a grandmother, a role I'd never quite imagined for myself, but was already looking forward to with profound anticipation. I thought about the woman I'd been when Sarah was born 31 years ago, young, uncertain, desperately trying to be the perfect wife and mother. I thought about the woman I was now, confident, independent, secure in my own choices. This baby would know a very different grandmother than Sarah had known mother, and I was grateful for that evolution. Fall brought the usual rhythms of harvest festivals and changing leaves, but also new developments. My photography group had been invited to display our work at the local community centre's annual art show. Book Club was deep into the Russian countryside with the Rostov family. The Literacy Centre had received a grant that would allow us to expand our programme to include computer skills training. David, I heard through Sarah, was engaged to Rebecca, the librarian. The news produced no emotional response in me beyond a vague hope that he'd found happiness. It felt like hearing about the remarriage of a distant acquaintance, interesting but irrelevant to my own life. "How do you feel about Dad getting married again?" Sarah asked during one of our regular phone calls. "I feel nothing particular about it," I said honestly. "I hope they're happy together." "Really, no jealousy or regret?" "Honestly, no. Whatever your father and I had together is in the past. I'm not the same person I was then, and neither is he. We're both building different lives now, and that's as it should be." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm finally understanding what you meant about not being able to go backwards. It's not that the past was bad," I explained. "It's that I've outgrown it. Like a house you loved when your children were small, it was perfect for that time in your life, but you wouldn't want to move back into it now." That's a good analogy. As my pregnancy progressed, I found myself thinking more about legacy, not just material inheritance, but the example I was setting and the values I was modeling. What did I want this grandchild to know about living authentically, about making difficult choices, about the difference between compromise and self-betrayal? One cold December morning, I was walking through the park near my condo when I encountered a scene that stopped me in my tracks. An elderly man was sitting on a bench, clearly distressed, while a woman roughly my age stood nearby, talking on her phone. I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about nursing homes and financial decisions and family obligations. When she finished her call, the man looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Please, Linda, don't make me go there. I know I've been difficult, but I can change. We can make this work." The woman, also named Linda, apparently shook her head sadly. "Dad, we've talked about this. You need more care than I can provide. This isn't about punishment or anger. It's about what's best for both of us." "But I'm your father. Doesn't that count for something?" It counts for everything. That's why I'm making sure you're somewhere safe and well cared for, even though it's breaking my heart. I walked on, not wanting to intrude on their private moment, but their conversation echoed in my mind for hours afterward. Here was another woman making a difficult decision based on reality rather than sentiment, choosing what was truly loving over what appeared loving on the surface. That evening, I called my own father, who lived in an assisted living facility about an hour away. He was 85 and had moved there voluntarily 2 years earlier when it became clear that maintaining his house was becoming too difficult. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Oh, can't complain. Played bridge this afternoon and won 3 hands. Beat Mrs. Patterson by 20 points, and she's been bragging about her game for weeks." We chatted about his activities, his health, the friends he'd made at the facility. As we talked, I reflected on how different his transition had been from the painful scene I'd witnessed that morning. My father had made the choice himself, recognizing his limitations and acting on them before a crisis forced the issue. "You know, Linda," he said before we hung up, "I'm proud of how you've handled your life since the divorce. Takes courage to start over at your age." "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." "Your mother would have been proud too. She always said you had more backbone than you gave yourself credit for." My mother had died 5 years earlier, and I still missed her wisdom and perspective. But I was grateful to know that she would have approved of the choices I'd made. Christmas that year was different from any I'd experienced in decades. Instead of the elaborate family production that David had always insisted upon, I spent a quiet morning at home and then joined Margaret and her family for dinner. It was relaxed, intimate, filled with genuine warmth rather than obligatory performance. "This is the most peaceful Christmas I've had in years," I told Margaret as we cleaned up after dinner. "That's what happens when you stop trying to meet everyone else's expectations and start following your own heart." On New Year's Eve, my photography group gathered for a potluck dinner and reflection on the year past. As we shared our favorite images from the previous 12 months, I realized how much my perspective had literally and figuratively expanded. The photos I'd taken in January seemed tentative, careful. The ones from December showed growing confidence and willingness to experiment. "Your work has really evolved," commented David, a different David, a retired art teacher who'd become a good friend in the group. "You're taking more risks, trying more challenging compositions." "I think I'm finally comfortable with the idea that not every shot has to be perfect," I replied. "Sometimes the imperfect ones are more interesting." "That's true about more than just photography," observed Sandra, our group's unofficial philosopher. As midnight approached, I found myself thinking about resolutions. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to promise dramatic self-improvement or ambitious goals. I was content with who I was and where I was going. At the stroke of midnight, surrounded by friends, I made a simple commitment to myself to continue choosing authenticity over expectation, growth over comfort, my own truth over other people's definitions of what my life should look like. February arrived with the promise of spring and the anticipation of new life. Sarah's pregnancy was progressing beautifully, and she'd decided to wait until the birth to learn the baby's gender. I spent my weekends helping her prepare the nursery, painting walls a soft yellow and assembling furniture with more enthusiasm than skill. "I keep thinking about what kind of grandmother I want to be," I told her as we hung curtains one Saturday afternoon. "You're going to be amazing, Mom. You're going to be the grandmother who teaches this baby that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose yourself." "Is that really the lesson you want me to teach?" Sarah looked at me seriously. "It's the most important lesson I can think of. Self-respect, boundaries, the courage to build the life you actually want, instead of settling for the life you think you should have. Those are the things that matter." On a cold Friday morning in late February, Sarah went into labor. I met her and Jake at the hospital, where I spent the next 12 hours pacing, reading, and trying to contain my excitement. When my granddaughter finally arrived, 6 pounds 2 ounces of perfect possibility, I cried tears of pure joy. "She's beautiful," I whispered, holding her for the first time while Sarah rested. What should we call you? Jake asked. Grandma, grandmother, Nana. I looked down at the tiny face already so alert and aware. How about Gigi? It sounds like someone who might have interesting stories to tell. Gigi it is, Sarah said with a tired but radiant smile. As I held my granddaughter, I thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The decision to leave an unhappy marriage. The choice to build a new life rather than accept loneliness. The recent decision to protect that life by saying no to the past. Each choice had been difficult in its own way, but each had also been a step toward becoming the woman I was meant to be. What are you thinking about, Mom? Sarah asked. Just how grateful I am for all of it, the hard parts and the good parts and everything that brought us here. Spring brought new energy and new projects. My granddaughter Lily, Sarah and Jake had chosen the name during one of our nursery preparation sessions, was thriving a content baby who seemed to observe the world with serious curiosity. I visited several times a week, marveling at the rapid changes that marked her growth. My photography group had been invited to participate in a regional exhibition, and I was excited to submit some of my recent work. Book Club had finally finished War and Peace and was celebrating with a Russian-themed dinner that promised to be either delicious or disastrous. The Literacy Centre had expanded its computer training program, and I was learning alongside my students as we navigated new technology together. One evening in April, as I was editing photos on my laptop, I received an unexpected email from David's new wife, Rebecca. The subject line read, "Thank you," which intrigued me enough to open it. "Dear Linda," it began. "I hope this message doesn't intrude on your privacy, but I felt compelled to reach out to you. David has told me about his attempt to reconcile with you last year and about your decision to decline. I wanted you to know how grateful I am for that decision, not because I'm jealous or insecure, but because your firm boundary forced David to really examine his motivations and behaviors. The work he did in therapy after you said no has made him a much better partner to me than he could have been otherwise. I know this might sound strange, but I feel like I owe you a debt of gratitude. Your refusal to accept less than you deserved taught him to offer more than he had before. I hope you're well and happy. Rebecca." I read the email several times, surprised by the depth of insight it revealed. Here was a woman who understood that my decision to protect my own well-being had ultimately benefited her relationship as well. It was an unexpected validation of the ripple effects that authentic choices can create. I wrote back a brief but warm response thanking her for her thoughtfulness and wishing her and David well. As I hit send, I reflected on the strange interconnectedness of human relationships, how one person's decision to honor their own truth could create space for others to do the same. Summer arrived with its familiar rhythms of longer days and outdoor activities. Lily was old enough now to enjoy being outside, and I loved taking her for walks in her stroller, pointing out flowers and birds, and the play of light through leaves. She seemed to find everything fascinating, reminding me to notice details I might otherwise overlook. "She's going to be an artist like her Gigi," Sarah predicted one afternoon as we watched Lily track the movement of shadows across her blanket. "Or a scientist or a teacher or anything she wants to be. That's the point, isn't it, having the freedom to become whoever she's meant to be." On a warm evening in late June, my photography group organised a sunset shoot at the lake outside town. As I set up my equipment, I found myself thinking about the year that had passed since David's reconciliation attempt. 12 months ago, I'd been forced to defend choices I'd thought were settled. Now those same choices felt more solid than ever, reinforced by lived experience rather than just conviction. "You seem very content lately," observed Sandra as we waited for the golden hour light. "I feel content, settled in a good way. It shows in your photographs. There's a confidence there, a willingness to trust your instincts." As the sun began to set over the water painting, the sky in shades of rose and gold, I raised my camera and began to shoot. Each frame felt like a small celebration of the moment, the light, the the peace I'd found in this life I'd built for myself. That night, as I reviewed the images on my laptop, I was struck by their clarity and composition. They were technically better than my early work, but more than that, they seemed to capture something essential about finding beauty in ordinary moments. They were the photographs of someone who was fully present in her own life. In August, I celebrated my 58th birthday with a party that perfectly reflected the woman I'd become. Margaret organised a surprise gathering at the community centre where my photography group met. My book club friends were there, along with colleagues from the literacy centre, neighbours from my condo building, and of course Sarah, Jake and Lily. "You know what I love about this party," Sarah said as we stood together watching my granddaughter charm a room full of adults. "Everyone here is someone you chose to have in your life. No obligations, no family drama, just people who genuinely care about you." "That's the best kind of family," I agreed. As the evening wound down, I found myself surrounded by cards and small gifts that reflected how well these friends knew me. Books I'd mentioned wanting to read, a beautiful journal for writing down photo ideas, handmade soaps from Margaret's Garden Herbs, a gift certificate for the art supply store. "This is what happiness looks like," Margaret said as we cleaned up afterward. Yes, it is. Fall brought new opportunities and deeper contentment. The regional photography exhibition had accepted 3 of my pieces, and I was honoured to be included alongside much more experienced artists. Book Club had embarked on a year-long exploration of women writers from around the world. Lily was walking now, toddling around Sarah's house with the determined focus of someone with important places to go. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after David's first reconciliation text, I was working in the community garden when Mrs. Rodriguez approached with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about our conversation last year," she said, settling beside me on the garden bench, "about remembering who we were before we became half of a couple. I remember. How has that journey been for you?" "Challenging and wonderful, just like I expected. But I wanted to tell you something I realised recently." "What's that?" "I'm not actually becoming who I was before I got married. I'm becoming who I was always meant to be, but never had the chance to explore. It's not about going backward, it's about going forward with more awareness." Her words resonated deeply. "That's a beautiful way to put it. I think that's what you did when you said no to your ex-husband. You chose to keep growing instead of returning to an earlier version of yourself." As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's insight. She was right. The woman I'd become wasn't the woman I'd been before marriage, but rather the woman I might have become if I'd always felt free to make choices based on my own values and desires. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about the conversation. "I love that," she said. "It's like you didn't just get divorced, you got emancipated." Emancipated, I like that word. Me too. It feels more active, more intentional than just single or divorced. Winter arrived early that year with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping faster than usual. But I found myself feeling energized rather than confined by the season. I'd signed up for a pottery class at the community centre, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for during my married years. "You're a natural," the instructor said as I worked at the wheel one evening. "Very patient, very willing to let the clay guide you." I think I'm finally learning to work with what I have, instead of trying to force things into shapes they don't want to take. That's the secret to good pottery. It's probably the secret to a lot of things. December brought the usual holiday preparations, but with a new dimension: Lily's first Christmas. At 10 months old, she was fascinated by lights and wrapping paper and the general festive chaos. Sarah and Jake hosted a small gathering on Christmas Eve, and as I watched my granddaughter's delight in the simple pleasure of tearing paper, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for this unexpected chapter of my life. "She's going to have such different memories of family gatherings than I did," Sarah observed as we cleaned up afterward. "How so?" "No tension, no walking on eggshells, no underlying drama, just people who actually enjoy being together." That's what she deserves. That's what we all deserve. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 years earlier, I'd been forced to defend my decision to remain independent against pressure from my ex-husband and initially my daughter. Now that independence felt so natural, so integral to who I was, that I could barely remember why it had ever been questioned. On New Year's Eve, I attended another potluck with my photography group. As we shared images from the past year and talked about plans for the future, I realized that I no longer thought in terms of what I was avoiding or protecting myself from. Instead, I thought about what I was moving toward: new skills, to learn new places to explore with my camera, new relationships, to deepen. "What's your resolution this year?" Sandra asked as midnight approached. "To keep saying yes to growth and no to anything that makes me smaller," I replied, at the stroke of midnight, surrounded by friends who valued my perspective and appreciated my journey. I felt a deep sense of completion. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of arriving at a place and a way of being that felt authentically, joyfully mine. As I drove home through the quiet streets, snow beginning to fall gently against my windshield, I thought about the letter I might write to the woman I'd been 3 years ago, just beginning to navigate the difficult waters of David's departure from our marriage. What would I tell her about the journey ahead? I would tell her that the grief she was feeling was real and necessary, but that it wasn't permanent. I would tell her that the life she was afraid to build alone would turn out to be more fulfilling than anything she'd known before. I would tell her that saying no to the wrong things would create space for the right things to flourish. Most importantly, I would tell her to trust herself, that the instincts she was learning to listen to would guide her toward a version of herself she couldn't yet imagine, but would deeply love. But of course she would have to discover all of that for herself, just as I had. That was the only way the lessons would stick, the only way the growth would be real. At home in my quiet condo, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my reading chair with a new book Margaret had recommended. Through my windows I could see the snow continuing to fall, transforming the familiar cityscape into something magical and new. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new moments to capture with my camera, new conversations with friends, new milestones in Lily's development. It was a good life, not perfect, but authentically mine. I had built it choice by choice, decision by decision, learning to trust my own judgment and honor my own needs. And when tested, those foundations had held firm. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to go backward, trusting instead that the person you've become has wisdom worth honoring. This is a dramatized story created for entertainment and inspiration, not medical, legal, or financial advice.